Well, I hope that you've had a good day today. I hope you've had a good week so far. I'm excited about getting to study Ecclesiastes tonight. We're in Ecclesiastes chapter 6. So if you haven't read Ecclesiastes chapter 6, it's probably best to pause the video, read through that, try to figure out the context maybe about how our previous discussions relate to chapter 6, and then that'd be a good time to probably unpause the video and we can discuss chapter 6 some. I know that we have several people that are out because they are sick, and we certainly want to let you know that if you're one of those people, that we love you and that we are praying for you. If we don't know that you're sick or you're hurting in some way, please let us know. We want to know so we can be praying for you. And if you need anything at all, we just ask that you would ask us. We don't have any announcements, so we'll go ahead and jump into Ecclesiastes chapter 6. You might remember in chapter 5, we talked about God, but we also talked again about riches. This is a reoccurring theme in the book of Ecclesiastes. The theme of material possessions and how ultimately they are useless and they provide no meaning in life. Well, this is what we read in verse 1. There is an evil that I have seen under the sun, and it lies heavy on mankind. So right out of the gate, here we go. We have another evil. Now remember, we're thinking about material possessions here. But notice what we've already learned about material possessions. Material possessions are given to humans by God. Okay, so God can choose whether a person has those material possessions or not. Now you remember the great anesthetic, I guess we could say, that is given to humans in this life so that they don't focus on how, or I should say that they're not as aware of how bad life really is than the person who doesn't have this. You remember what that is. That is to, eat and drink and find some pleasure in your toil. We've already read that. Kohelet has already talked about that. But remember, God is ultimately the one that gives the person something to eat and something to drink and ultimately decides whether a person can find some pleasure in their toil. And it seems that Kohelet hasn't been given that benefit by God. Well, notice that the same is true with these material possessions. But notice that sometimes people have these material possessions. In fact, they have wealth, they have possessions, and they have honor, like we read about in verse 2. But they're not able to enjoy them. So some people have them because God has given it to them and He's allowed them to enjoy it. Some people have these things, but God doesn't let them enjoy it. And that seems to be more of a miserable life than a person that just doesn't have it at all. Some people, I guess we should say, the ones that aren't given these possessions or wealth or honor by God, some people spend their entire life thinking about how satisfied they would be if they just had that life. And that also is a miserable life, that also is meaningless, and it provides no meaning in life. Now notice, though, that Kohelet attributes this negative situation to God, okay? It is God's fault. He makes it hard on these people. Well, notice the person that's given wealth and possessions and honor, but God doesn't let that person enjoy them. But notice what is said at the end of verse 2. But a stranger enjoys them. This is vanity. It is a grievous evil. So it's not enough that God just, tortures the person by giving this person these things that could be enjoyed, but God doesn't allow them to enjoy it. That's not enough. God allows another person to enjoy these things. God frustrates the possessor, I guess we could say, by allowing the stranger to eat from what is his. Well, we go to verse 3. If a man fathers 100 children and lives many years, so that the days of his years are many, but his soul is not satisfied with life's good things, and he has no burial, I say that a stillborn child is better off than he. Well, notice that Kohelet definitely starts out with hyperbole, right? We're not talking actually about a man that has 100 children, but we are imagining a situation in which a man would have 100 children. Now, this is supposed to be a very, very good thing. This is supposed to be something that would bring joy to one's life. Notice what Psalm 127 says. Let me get there. Psalm 127. Behold, verse 3, children are a heritage from the Lord, the fruit of the womb a reward. Like arrows in the hand of a warrior are the children of one's youth. Blessed is the man who fills his quiver with them. He shall not be put to shame when he speaks with his enemies in the gate. Again, it is a good thing in the Old Testament if one has children. Now, you would think by reading about this scenario in which a person has 100 children that they would be happy. That would bring them some pleasure in life. But before we finish that thought, let's finish. If a man fathers 100 children and lives many years, okay, that is also something to be joyous about. It is a desired thing in the Old Testament for people to live. The book of Proverbs talks about the benefits of a long life, and usually the person, that has wisdom is usually given a long life, but that's beside the point. So Kohelet seems to be arguing with these general truths, right? A person can have kids and a long life and still find that their life is absolutely, positively, totally miserable. In fact, so miserable that a stillborn has a better fate than this person which we are describing. Let that sink in for a second. A stillborn is better off than the man that has 100 children, has a long life, and ultimately, the one that has no burial. We really didn't talk about that. Verse 4. For it, so we're talking about, the stillborn. For it comes in vanity and goes in darkness, and in darkness its name is covered. So this verse again expands the description of the stillborn. Now, notice what is said about a stillborn in Psalm 58 in verse 8. This is what we read. Let them be like the snail that dissolves into slime, like the stillborn child who never sees the sun. Okay, that's not something that people, desire. People desire to have children. People don't desire to have stillborns. That ought to be a very sad and very miserable thing that happens to a person in their life. But notice this, okay? Kohelet is not saying that, a stillborn, having a stillborn is just something that is just great, right? That's not what he's saying. Notice the fate of the stillborn is bad, and the fate of the person that we've been describing is also bad, but the stillborn's fate is the fate that is supposed to be favored. Why? Because it lacks consciousness. Again, notice what Kohelet said in chapter 4 and verse 3. You might remember this, when he's talking about oppression, and that he says, the dead is better off than the living. But what did he say after that to heighten what he was saying? But better than both is he who has not yet been and has not seen the evil deeds that are done under the sun. So why is the being, the person that has never existed up until this point, better off than the dead or the living? Because they haven't seen or experienced at all the oppression in the world, okay? Well, the same type of ideas apply to the stillborn in chapter 6. Now, we move to verse 5. Moreover, it has not seen the sun or known anything. Well, okay, what are we to make of have not known anything? Have not known what? We would expect something to come after, known, but nothing is there. Well, we could say the stillborn that has no knowledge. Okay, that would definitely back up the point that the stillborn lacks consciousness. It doesn't know what is going on. Even, verse 6, even though he should live 1,000 years twice over, yet enjoy no good, do not all go to the one place. Now, notice again, this is hyperbole. We've already seen this when he's talking about 100 children. But notice now we're imagining a situation in which a man lives, 2,000 years, okay? That should be a really good thing. That should be something to rejoice about. But notice that a long life, even one that lasts 2,000 years, is also meaningless because death will eventually claim that life. Death still comes even if one has an extremely long life. Verse 7. All the toil of man is for his mouth, yet his appetite is not satisfied. Well, here's what seems to be a proverb for us. And we understand this, but notice again, we're thinking about material possessions, wealth, possessions, that sort of thing. Maybe honor, what we looked at before. Man works, I guess we could say, to try to find some satisfaction through these material possessions. That's ultimately why man works. Man works because he thinks that by working he can gain something. Something will be given to him, something that has substance, something that is worth seeking. I guess we could say. That's characteristics of humans, right? Humans tend to continually strive to satisfy their desires. But notice what this verse says. They're never able to do that. Now, we might pause for a second and think about our life. We spend a majority of the time in our life trying to get ahead. We want the best job, and when we get the job that we want, guess what? We want one that's better. While we're in our jobs, we want the best position, and we continually, work until we get that position. We're always working for the next pay raise. We're always working to find something that we think will satisfy us. But when we finally occupy the position that we want or have the job that we want, guess what we find out? It is not what it was cracked up to be. The destination is not as glorious as we imagined. In fact, we usually realize that the journey is a lot better than the destination, but that's another point for another day. Besides the point right now, our desire, our appetite, to steal the word from chapter 6 and verse 7, is constantly roaming around, trying to find satisfaction, but it never will. For what advantage has the wise man over the fool, and what does the poor man have who knows how to conduct himself before the living? Now hold on just a second. We've been talking about wealth. We've been talking about possessions. Why in the world are we now talking about, wisdom versus folly? That doesn't seem to fit. Well, if you notice, you read Proverbs and wisdom literature like that, when people desire to be wise, when people seek after wisdom, those people are usually given wealth. The fool is usually poor. The fool is not usually wealthy. In other words, wisdom kind of puts a person on the right path in life to enjoy material possessions and gain in life. But if material possessions can't give us meaning, which we've already seen in chapter 6 so far, right? If material possessions can't give us meaning, then we really ought to question the benefit of wisdom, shouldn't we? Because if wisdom doesn't help you get rich, at least this is the way Kohelet is thinking, then what use is it for the poor man to seek after wisdom? Why should the poor man try to find wisdom and thereby change his life, acquire behavior, or develop behaviors that would help him gain in this world, materially speaking? Why? There's no benefit, it doesn't seem. Better is the sight of the eyes than the wandering of the appetite. This also is vanity and striving after wind. Well, okay. Better is the sight of the eyes than the wandering of the appetite. Now notice that again. The appetite is wandering about, right? It is trying to find something to latch onto that just might give it satisfaction. But nothing will. Nothing will ultimately ever satisfy the appetite. I shouldn't have said that. Something will satisfy the appetite. And we'll get to that at the end of the book. It's the fear of God and keeping God's commandments, right? But materially speaking, there's nothing that we could ever get that will satisfy our desires, our appetite. So what does Kohelet mean when he says better is the sight of the eyes than the wandering of the appetite? Well, it seems that he's saying it's better just to focus on what you have, what is in front of you, than spending so much time thinking about what you don't have, because it is just going to make you more miserable in life. Chapter 6. Chapter 6 in Ecclesiastes can be more depressing than some of the other chapters in the book. But they teach us something. And we're going to finish chapter 6 next week. We'll finish chapter 6 and we'll get into chapter 7. We're going to end here tonight. I can't wait to see everybody Sunday. God bless.